Looks like Grant joined us. Hi, Grant.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hi,
Thanks for.
Grant.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're excited to hear what you're doing. So
Yeah,
thank you so much.
likewise.
Wonderful. All right. Hi, there's Nancy. All right, terrific. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order, and I'm going to read this so that everybody realizes that the meeting is being held pursuant to and in compliance with the Albemarle County's continuity of government ordinance, and that the meeting is being recorded. All right, so welcome everybody. And let's see, we are just missing Michael and Kate and Peggy. So we do have a quorum to move forward. And we are going to, let's see, we have our guest, we have Grant, thank you so much. And then we also have Chris Hawk, who, please welcome Chris, who's attending, and really glad to have you. And Chris, if you wanna contribute to the meeting, please let Carolyn know, and we'd be happy to answer any questions or hear feedback from you. So welcome everybody. All right, so why don't we go ahead and start by reviewing the agenda and approving it. And Kim, if you could put that up, that'd be great. All right. So there is our agenda, and do we have a motion to approve this? And hopefully everybody has had a chance to take a look at it.
Sure. Move to approve.
Wonderful. All right, thanks, Emily. Do we have a second on that?
I'm sorry, I'll second that.
Thank you very much. All right, great. And I hope everybody had a chance to look at the September minutes. And if there's any comment about those, we can hear that now. And if not, if we can, someone could move to approve those. Oh, do we need to make sure we get everybody, do we need to do a roll call on that? Let me go back, I'm sorry. Let me go down the roll and see if we have approval of the agenda. Nancy, do you approve?
Nancy, you're muted.
There you go, I pushed all my buttons. Oh, yes.
Oh, thank you. Leah, do you approve? Oh no, now that's the other question. Leah, have you been officially appointed, Leah? Have you gotten a letter?
I haven't received anything yet.
Huh.
Yeah, and I checked the minutes from the Board of Supervisor meetings, and I didn't see it on there. So I will check in though with the clerk's office and see on that, because it's been a while. It's been a little while.
Yeah, it definitely has. Huh.
I should mention that I don't think I'm officially a member right now either, because I think I missed my reappointment. I did put in my application, but I don't know that I've been reappointed.
Okay, we'll check on that one too.
Oh my. Well, we got Emily's approval of that and Nancy's approval.
Yes, which means I couldn't have moved before. Someone else will have to second that because I can't.
Right. Nancy, can you second that?
I second it.
All right. Well, let's move on to the minutes then. Did everybody get a chance to look at that, and can we move to approve those, the September minutes?
Yes, I'll move to approve.
Thank you, Emily.
And I second.
Wonderful. Okay, very good. All right. So we're going to go ahead looking at the agenda. We talked about a meeting time change, and this would work better for Carolyn if we can move. And I think we heard back from everybody except for Peggy. And I would actually like to start in November. So that means we would have our next meeting fairly soon. Perhaps we could vote on that change. So this would make us, let's see.
I move that we move the meeting times to the first Monday of the month, which would start in November.
That was the day before the election.
It's the first Thursday. We're not doing.
Oh, no, yeah, you're right, you're right. I'm keeping thinking Monday, sorry.
Sorry.
Thursday. Yeah, so right after the election.
First Thursday, okay.
First Thursday. Sorry, I keep on saying that. So it would be the 5th of the 5th of November.
So I move that we change our meeting time from the 3rd to the first Thursday of the month, but at the same time, 5 to 7, and begin in November.
Wonderful. Do we have a second on that?
But before we do that, there is an option, I think, to go back to the 5:30 time if there's a preference for that. And I know that Emily, I think, and Lonnie, you had both had a preference for that. So I don't want to have a big discussion about it, but I just wanted to put it out there because when we vote, that will sort of become our official time again. So anyone has any feedback on that, now is probably a good time.
Yeah.
I can do either.
Right now in the winter and their COVID, it doesn't it doesn't matter to me down the road, assuming regular activities resume. 5:30 would definitely be a little bit easier for me personally.
Yeah, I think 5:30 would be a little bit better for me. I mean, I can adapt, but it cuts work a little bit short for me.
But can Carolyn do that because there was another, potentially she's doing something else after our meeting?
No,
Which is
not on the
Monday.
first Thursday. The first Thursday is all yours. I don't have any other meetings but this one if we move it to the first Thursday. So 5:30 to 7:30 is fine. First Thursday of the month, if that's what you want.
So
I'm okay with it.
Great. So Leah, is that okay with you?
Doesn't matter to me.
Okay. And I can check in with Michael and Kate and Peggy and just make sure. But so Nancy, you have made the motion to change the date.
So I will amend it to change the meeting time also from 5 to 7 to 5:30 to 7:30.
Right, thank you.
And I'll second.
Wonderful. All right, thank you so much. Great. All right. And so we're going to just try to move pretty quickly through the items that we have listed on our agenda. And is that okay with you, Grant? Are you okay kind of sitting through our meeting? Then we'll give you the hour at the end.
No problem at all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your patience. So some important site updates. Kim and I met Dan Mahone at the Avon Swamp, and originally we were Nancy was going to join us in Tim Pataloni, but they weren't able to make it. But we did have a fruitful discussion. We talked about, well, we sort of looked at the boundaries of where this swamp is, what part of it is actually in the park and what is owned by the homeowners association. And then we revisited the discussion about the possibility of inviting volunteers to do some trail maintenance and engaging them with invasive plant removal And we just had a great conversation with Dan Mahone and learned a little bit more of the history and the workings of the park and his part in it. So it was a fruitful visit. And it was a beautiful afternoon. And then I don't know if you want to add anything, Kim, to that.
No, just that, I guess just one thing that we're just continuing the discussion about, focusing on that as the plan develops for management of Biscuit Run, because of the, the rare plants and animals that are there as well. So it could be a focus for invasive species management and, and for trails management as well. And maybe some education and interpretation opportunities.
Right. And engage, how wonderful it would be to engage like the people that live in those developments and the relationship with the homeowners association and access into the park through there. So we had all those conversations. And I also want to welcome Rod and Maggie Walker. It's great to always have you attend our meetings. So we're so glad that you're here. And then
So Christine, I had a question. So have we checked the county GIS to make sure that the resource protection buffer that it surrounds that wetland, that it's in the GIS layer?
I don't know.
Oh, so anyway, I mean, it might be useful to know just in case there's other activities that the neighborhood proposes or the developer of the neighborhood proposes, that it's known that that there's a mandated 100-foot buffer that needs to be around that.
Yeah, and
I'll check that out. It's a good suggestion.
yeah, thank you, Lonnie.
Yeah.
And so, sort of another one of our important sites is that Sugar Hollow area, and Lonnie did a great job of putting down a lot of great ideas. And so I hope that everybody had a chance to look at that list. And are there any thoughts on that right now? And thinking about, so what is the next step as well? And who does that feedback go to?
Well, so we talked about that in our committee. I thought I was going to talk about that later in our committee report.
Well, we can do that if you'd like. We can just hold off. How's that sound?
Sounds fine.
Okay, great. Were there any other site visits or landowner contacts that anybody wants to report on? All right. Well, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about the Charlotte Humphreys Education Initiative. And that's really exciting news. Kim and I met with Amy Smith and talked about the plans, in the CAC there seems to be on board for having educational signage put in place. And I think I shared a list of ideas, and Kim also did a nice job sort of outlining our conversation that, I don't know, Kim, do you want to put that up now or wait, or potentially share that later? But what was what was great is that we have a terrific opportunity, and it sounds like there's money available and a community that is very supportive of having that educational material. And some of the things that we talked about would be using QR codes to provide information about the native trees and or invasives, and also some information that can talk about biodiversity. And so there's Kim's great document where she sort of outlined some of the things that we talked about. And the other cool thing is this seems to dovetail with, is it a water retention?
It's a stormwater facility, the Burnham Basin, that is adjacent to Charlotte Humphreys Park. So they were also some of the folks from Facilities and Environmental Services, some of you will recall, we're also talking about some signage for native plant restoration projects on the stormwater facilities. And because the Burnham Basin is right next to Charlotte Humphreys, there might be an opportunity for those two projects to kind of dovetail and coordinate. So that's the discussion right now.
So exciting news that it sounds like we can really begin to move forward on giving some input with this and helping to push this forward. And hopefully this will be one of the things that the educational subcommittee can have a further discussion about as well, or support any movement forward with this. So it's very exciting. All right.
You know, I read through both of your documents, and under Sean Humphrey sent it, this and also Avon's Fault made me think about, I think the Google Docs are really helpful, and when you're trying to figure something out, and if we had a place also under a topic where we put meetings with others or something like that, so that, you know, you really remember who you met with and when, so that if somebody else, like it's me, oh, they talked to Amy Smith. Oh, but they didn't talk to Kim Swanson. And she really has worked a lot on this and cares about that. I better be sure they talk to Kim Swanson. You know, and so if there was a place where we would know what contacts have been made, that you talked to Dan Mahan about this. Just,
Yeah.
you know, that they could hang together just a little bit better.
That's a good suggestion.
I'll remind people that for each of our important sites, we do have a correspondence folder, which might be an appropriate place. But for something like this, I'm not sure where this is living right now because it's not listed as an important site. But I do agree with Nancy. We've thought about the fact that keeping track of that kind of correspondence and seeing who's been reached out to was an idea that we had. So we just need to implement it for things that aren't part of the important sites.
Well, Emily, we did talk about in the past about treating our parks, not exactly as important sites, but in a similar sort of way. And I think, you know, taking the same, you know, having a similar folder structure and set of comments and so forth for each of our parks that we've had engagement with.
Oh, that's a good idea.
We certainly could do that, and we can put them under the important sites potential folders, you know, each individual park. And then if we ever vote to move it to an important site, then we can just move the folder into the, you know, other directory.
Or just create a super folder of, we have special sites and then we have parks.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah.
It could be done either way. Because I mean,
Right.
I guess some of our special sites are parks. So, I mean, maybe the potential, your original one is.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about putting things in folders and then
Yeah.
helping people to know how to get to the folder, the right folder to find it.
Right. The other thing, I guess, just to remind everyone that is kind of the purpose of the document that we were editing for several months, the rolling work plan. And there's space there for those things, for tracking correspondence. And I think Christine and I have been updating it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of sort of the concise version of just tracking each thing. And so I guess I would caution against having multiple places of doing the same thing. But if folks would rather do it a different way, then, you know, I would just do it one way so that you don't have to update it, you know, in multiple places.
Well, the work plan sounds good as the first place you look for everything, just so that we have a, you know, a flow sheet, as it were. And I like that, of putting it right on that worksheet. Yeah.
And maybe in that work plan, we can also say like a created doc and indication of like where it is found. Created doc, Charlotte Humphreys Environmental Education Initiative, found in whatever folder.
Right.
That would help it might, or even put the link in there would even be better. So you could easily find that. Well, great. I think does everybody sound okay, feel okay with that? Keeping that rolling work plan? And that way it's nicely organized and we're constantly being reminded of our goals. So I think that that's a good place for us to continue to update and to go to that if everybody is agreeable to that. But I think there are ways that we can help be able to access documents through that rolling work plan if we put some of those links in there. All right. So, and then we also want to talk about invasive. We met with Rod, Kim and I, Rod Walker, about invasive management in the county, and Kim just typed up is great. She sort of laid out what the county policy is in terms of applying herbicides and the application policy and possible path forward to training maintenance staff on invasives and using citizen volunteers in the future. So it feels really positive that we know what the policy is, and Kim's been able to develop some of these relationships and getting sort of the go-ahead for certain paths forward in involving citizen volunteers and really addressing the invasive plant problem. So still have more to go, but making headway in that direction. So I wanted to report on that. Any questions or additional thoughts?
I'll just add a quick follow-up that document, it's sort of summarizing what the policies are for Albemarle. This was Rod's suggestion, and it was a good one. And still working now on getting review from Parks and Rec, so we can make sure that everything I put in there is accurate. But then I think it will be a good reference document for us and for distributing to other groups that have shown interest in, master naturalists and other folks who want to come to county parks and do projects to sort of help facilitate that and be clear about the policies and how to go about organizing that.
Great. Yeah, I think it was a really positive step forward. So we're going to move on to subcommittee updates. The education subcommittee is going to meet on Monday, and I'm going to send out a little agenda. One of the things that I would like to put on there is a discussion about the website, and that we could actually start there. So even though the website discussion is on our agenda today, we're going to move that and talk about it with the education subcommittee. And so the policy subcommittee met today, and Lonnie, do you want to just give us a brief overview of what you guys discussed? And will your meeting always be, like, do you have a regular time for your meeting?
We do not currently have a regular time for a meeting. We'll be in discussion about that, trying to figure that out. So first thing is, Kim, could you share the first document that we worked on? It was the, why is my brain fuzzy? Oh yeah, the Sugar Hollow document, the policy recommendations. Anyway, have all of you had a chance to go out and look at that document? We made some changes. Yeah, we made some changes. Oh, and I see she filled in 2004. That's great. We added a nice little map, so you can see. And we really want to emphasize too, I think there's this assumption that Sugar Hollow, I mean, a lot of people that don't live in Sugar Hollow think of Sugar Hollow as just that little tiny area around the reservoir. But really with the map, we wanted to emphasize that Sugar Hollow really is kind of starts at Whitehall and goes all the way to the reservoir. So it's a much larger area than people think of it being. Just let you guys look through there. But So some of the things in here, looking at traffic calming, trying to maybe think about creating some other places that we could either acquire or get access easements on that would disperse some of the activity along the course of the road as opposed to just the terminus. Blocking the dam, making it the road emergency vehicles only. We talked quite a bit about trash, which we know is an issue. I originally thought it might be a good idea to put a trash can down there, but I was persuaded otherwise by my fellow committee members. And that really maybe we need to provide some signage about leave no trace and so forth. So that's what that says now. Then of course, educational kiosks about biodiversity. And then also establishing a cooperative agreement with the City of Charlottesville and the RWSA to better police the area and address illegal activities and the rest of the recommendations. So I don't know if there's any questions on those, if other people had additions, suggestions, or if we feel like that this is in a state where we're ready to move it forward.
We talked about where to move it forward, and we agreed that the place to move it forward was the Board of Supervisors. And we also talked about trying to have really clear signage that would be graphic, because we have people that speak quite a few languages in our area, not just English.
Yeah, and that's something that I've definitely noticed. I mean, I've people with a illegal campfire almost right, maybe 15 feet from a sign that said no fires, but the no fires was in English. The people with the fire were Latino and probably couldn't read the sign. So if anything, a little image of a fire with across it. I think they've started to do better with that out there. I think they have revised some of their signs, but it's always an important thing to remember when we put together signs for parks that not everyone speaks English as their first language.
Well, I thought it looked great.
Yeah, I felt like it covered all of the points that we had talked about. And probably you added some more too that we hadn't talked about before. So I thought it looked good.
So do we want to let it percolate any longer, or do we want someone to go ahead and approve this to be sent to the Board of Supervisors?
I'd like to mention something, Lonnie. I thought it looked good too. I looked through it all before you added the map, and the map is helpful. But in terms of people biking or running along that road, what about safety issues? I mean, it's almost a little bit scary driving it anyway, because of the curves and the blind curves and then the one-way bridges and all of that. Do many people run it or bike it now? And do we want to encourage that? Emily's saying yes.
Yeah. Many people do bike and run it right now. And it's sort of like, if you only have one person, on days when there's less runners or less cyclists, I say it's actually more dangerous, because then people will actually build up speed. Like you'll have some college kid like driving really fast. But like on Saturdays, when you have like a huge number of people out biking, running, the cars know they're going to encounter so many cyclists and runners that they just start driving slow. So that actually having more cyclists and runners actually, in a way, kind of serves as its own traffic calming, which is fine by me. Of course, I mean, I'm biased because I am a runner.
And we also talked about having a traffic specialist look at all that and maybe try to talk to homeowners about ways that a path could be put on their property, just like has been done in other areas. So we were concerned about that as well.
We do have at least one unofficial trail that takes people off the road. That can take people off the road. It's currently not like it's currently a private trail, but I use that all the time. And so, I mean, there are ways, but trail run, you can't do that with road bikes. There's always going to be runners and cyclists on there, I think. But the big thing is there's 3 bridges, and for people who haven't been down there much, there's 3 bridges that are kind of narrow country single lane bridges, and they're kind of at a 90-degree angle to the road, right? So you have to, when people are rushing down the road, they often won't, there's, particularly in the summer, there's a lot of vegetation. There's often several situations where you can have head-on collisions with those bridges. We've had a lot of, there's a lot of near misses and stuff around those bridges because people, they don't realize they need to like stop and look. So that's one of the reasons that one of the recommendations was they might think about putting some rumble strips or something to signage or something to slow people down, particularly next to the bridges. But that in turn, as people are slowing down at the bridges, maybe they're slowing down in general, just realizing this is not someplace I should be driving 65.
You mentioned conservation easements potentially along the side of the road. Are bike paths allowed, or running paths, just like a trail, whatever, allowed in conservation easements?
Yeah, generally, well, it depends on the easement, and it was an access easement was really what we're talking about, and it wouldn't necessarily be for a trail, although most easements do accommodate. I mean, the reason that the Outdoor Foundation, exists in many ways is for outdoor recreation. So, yeah, typically most easements do allow for trails. But I did see Rod Walker I think Rod had a comment. Let's see if there's I thought it popped up for a second. Oh, is it clear what we're asking the Board of Supervisors to do, and who are we asking to do what next? I don't know if everyone saw that. That's in the chat. So I think that last line, I mean, maybe it shouldn't be the last bullet point. Maybe that last bullet point should be first instead of last. But really, it's to form a cooperative agreement between the three parties involved: the City of Charlottesville, the Rivanna Water and Sewer Authority, and of course, Albemarle, to really address those issues in a comprehensive manner. The City of Charlottesville owns the area immediately around the reservoir, so anything regarding that is going to have to be done by Charlottesville. And so Albemarle will have to negotiate with Charlottesville to get some of those things done. The things about the road itself, that's in the county of Albemarle, and we have, the county can work on those things itself. It can work with traffic engineers to address some of those issues. It can work with property owners along the sides of the road and so forth. Does that answer your question, Rod? I mean, if there's ways that we can clarify the document to clarify who's responsible for what in those bullet points, maybe we can do that.
Yeah. Lonnie, that was great, because it just wasn't clear to me, what the specific ask is. So it sounds like you're asking for a 3-way agreement to be put together, which will generate all the rest of the conversation. That sounds great.
Yes.
And it's not lost on me, because I've started a conversation with VDOT, that VDOT also has some role potentially in some of this too.
Yeah, and I've actually had a direct conversation with, I'm always forgetting what his name is, but I've had a direct conversation with the local VDOT representative about Sugar Hollow and the traffic concerns. And I think that they're open to the idea. And I think they even have some various kinds of grant funding that we could possibly apply for. For example, if we wanted to do like a little wildflower demonstration area, or we wanted to have some educational signage, or we wanted to, there's various opportunities that we may be able to work with VDOT on things you wouldn't imagine that they could do. They do have grant money from all kinds of that they can use for various projects.
And just so you know, not that it's overly relevant, or I don't know what'll ever come of it. I started a conversation literally with VDOT this morning about what are the rules associated with taking out trees like Ailanthus along the right-of-way, in Sugar Hollow. And, you know, it's a complicated topic, as you might imagine. But I'm going to attempt to get some clarity around how that would work or not work as time goes forward.
You know, kind of off, a little bit off topic, one idea I've had for years and years regarding Atlantis is you have like you know, they're great for growing oyster mushrooms. So maybe we work with like Sharondale Farm or something and work out a deal with landowners. Like we give them a package of oyster spawn and, you know, cut down the Atlantis into mushroom-sized logs.
The key question is who cuts it? If the landowner has to pay for it to be cut, that's a problem. But if somebody else is willing to come in and cut them, yeah, hallelujah.
It's a good question. I mean, I guess if it's in the right, you know, I had situations on my own property where there was like, when we were in Batesville, there was a tree that's kind of dying, and I knew when it did die, it'd fall on the road. And I said, hey, VDOT, can you just take care of that tree for me? And they did.
Right.
I guess if you get landowner permission in advance, like a landowner's like, yeah, please remove Atlantis, then maybe we could get
Well, you're going to love this distinction, but you know, if the tree dies on its own through Mother Nature and it represents a road hazard, VDOT will come and take it out. If you kill it, they won't.
Well, there you go.
Interesting.
So that's what I'm working on. I'm trying to solve this conundrum, because what that means is no landowner will ever kill one because they can't afford to pay to have somebody come remove it. So I'm trying to figure out how do we resolve this, because VDOT won't come do it on their own, and the landowner won't do it because they have to pay to have it removed, which means nobody will do it.
Well, we have several local tree companies. I wonder if we could get some free publicity for one of our, we have like tree companies like right in Sugar Hollow or like right in Whitehall. And I wonder if we could get like one of them, like for the sake of free publicity or something, to do it.
That would be a hallelujah.
Well, that sounds great, you guys, and a good project to be working on for sure. So thank you. So Lonnie, should we and others, should we go ahead and move to vote on this to allow you to take action, the next step, and send this letter out to, or do you want to keep working on it and then circulate it around? What do you recommend?
I think that we're done with that. I mean, I think we've passed it on to you. Unless you have other refinements, I mean, I think it'd be the committee's wish that we go ahead and forward this on to the Board of Supervisors. And to be clear, I think it would be Kim it would come from Kim.
No, that's not
No, it
correct.
comes from us.
It's from the
It comes from the
committee.
chair?
Yeah.
All
So
right.
it's the chair that sends it. Okay. All right.
Does it currently have listed the info about getting a traffic study?
I don't think we specifically call out a traffic study per se. Can we pull back up that bullet point to see what it says?
Because we would need a traffic study because we want to do a greenway all the way from Whitehall. We're not just talking about the residents.
Okay, see. So it would be that consider traffic calming measures. So maybe we could precede that with, what do we think? Something like pursue a traffic study at the very front of that sentence.
Okay.
I mean, do we think that that's, yeah, consider pursuing a traffic study.
Do you guys want to, will you, the policy committee, do you want to make those final changes, and then I can work it up into a letter to send out?
I think unless there's other changes from this committee here, or you guys feel like you need more time with it, I think it's
Ready to go.
I think it's ready to go.
All right. Do we need to formally vote on this, or can we?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you need to formally vote on that.
Okay. Can somebody move to approve sending a letter to the Board of Supervisors with these recommendations as outlined in this Google Doc?
I move that we send a letter about Sugar Hollow to the Board of Supervisors as outlined in the Google Doc we have just discussed.
And a second?
I'll second.
All right, great. And, you know, we are, and then Lonnie, of course, you approved of that. And so we have 3 members here today, right? 1, 2,
No, I have.
Oh,
no.
Peggy joined.
and Peggy. Oh, it's Peggy's here. Oh, great. Welcome, Peggy.
You're muted, Peggy.
Give me a chance
Hi, Peggy.
to get my mouse up there and find that little button. Yeah, sorry I'm late. I had a long day.
That's
All of a
okay.
sudden it's 5:35 and I realized, oh my God. Okay, I'm here.
That's
Yes, I'll say yes.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so we're going to move ahead on that. And the last thing that I just want to talk about is the Rivanna corridor plan review and feedback. And Lonnie gave some feedback. I heard from several of you on that. And I know that I have received a letter asking for feedback on it. And so if there's anything that anyone wants to add on that, I can take that and turn it into a formal letter to submit to the Thomas Jefferson Planning District group that's overseeing this.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that our committee also went through that in depth and added a bunch more suggestions and some refinements.
Great.
Hopefully you can see those. So otherwise, that looks good.
I was editing that document for the policy committee, so it looks like all the comments came from me, but they're from the policy committee. And if you have questions about them, just let us know and we can help you, edit it more if it needs to be.
I did want to give 2 other notes about the policy committee and other things that we discussed before moving on. We did also talk about the Chesapeake Bay Act and some various ideas that we might pursue in the future. We have a lot more to look at. But one of the things I want to bring back up is to reaffirm, I think this committee did vote on our 2 suggestions to support resource management areas and to support the county banning the removal of streams. And so that's something that's from the policy committee that we support that. I can't remember the original record, but if we may want to reaffirm that vote and officially move. I don't know if we ever actually sent a letter to the Board of Supervisors about our position on those items. We could also choose to wait until we've also got our comprehensive list of Chesapeake Bay's recommendations and send that as part of that whole package.
Might be easier though to just deal with a small section and get that thing taken care of.
I think it carries more weight if we send might be worthwhile to go ahead and send those. And to those who don't know, there's a nice little PowerPoint, not PowerPoint, a slideshow about resource management areas and why it is we don't want to remove intermittent streams.
Could you guys, could we discuss that at our next, in our November meeting? In more detail? Yeah, that would be great.
It's come several times before this committee, so at some point we should wrap it up and send it on.
Yeah.
And I know we've had a lot of turnover recently, so I understand if you want to take some time to look at it again.
Yeah.
On that topic, just really quick, I mentioned this to the policy committee, but the Stream Health Initiative is building now, and I've talked about this before, but really soon, certainly coming into the new year, there will be, public engagement efforts and opportunities to provide feedback too. So not to discourage providing feedback through this avenue, but there will be other opportunities as well. So just to look to that and the timing, that might be important to think about.
All right, great. Is there anything else, Lonnie? And if you could let us know if you're going to have a standing meeting date once you guys get that figured out, and if you guys are keeping minutes, it would be great to share those minutes with the rest of the group as well.
Yes, we will share minutes after they're approved at the next meeting, or as soon as I'm done. I don't know who our secretary is, but as soon as they're done being written up, be that me or someone else. But I'll share those minutes. And there were some other items that we talked about for things in progress that we're working on with the policy committee. So stay tuned.
Great, really excited.
It is a requirement under FOIA for subcommittees to keep their minutes, so all the other subcommittees know that you do have to have minutes. So.
Okay, great. I'm so glad you guys met, and excited to hear you guys have already done some great work. So before we leave the Rivanna corridor plan review, is this something that we need to vote on in order for me to send out a letter with those recommendations? I see Lonnie, you're shaking your head yes. Are we ready to do that? Did everybody get a chance to take a look at that? And if so, does someone want to make a motion to send those recommendations on?
I so move.
Okay, to move the recommendation.
And the recommendations on, they're excellent, yeah.
Okay. And do we have a second on that?
I'll second.
Thank you, Emily. And Lonnie, do you approve of that?
I can't vote.
I'm sorry, Nancy, do you approve?
I certainly do. That's what we said at our meeting today.
Okay, all right, terrific. All right, so we're ready to move on with that. I also wrote a letter about mowing, and I would love to be able to send that off on behalf of the group, but I don't think everybody has had a chance to take a look at that yet and to give me some feedback. So
I did work on it for a few minutes right before this meeting, and broke it up into a paragraph and changed it slightly. So I did work on it a bit, but 98% of it I thought was terrific.
Great.
I didn't catch all that. It was a letter on what? Can we pull it up?
It was on mowing. Just look to the Parks Department about mowing policy, and I've just used the example of Walnut Creek, and there's I think it used to be a hayfield, or it may even still be a hayfield that they're mowing, and just sort of opening, trying to begin the dialogue with them about reducing mowing in the county parks, and using some examples of where that could begin to happen. And then
so at our meeting, Kim was able to bring things up. Can you share that with us, Kim, or somebody to share that? What I did was, because Christine started with how that's what this committee is supposed to do, help with biodiversity, etc. And then she very nicely talked about the differences that she saw. So I think if we could just it's not a long letter. If we just put it up, I think people would like it.
All right, thanks, Kim.
Can you all see that now?
Yep.
Okay.
It's a really good letter, in my opinion.
Oh, thank you.
I think so too.
Yeah, so I mean, what I was hoping to do is just really begin this conversation and hopefully, you know, start this relationship and think about, are there ways that we can reduce mowing? I was just over at Walnut Creek today and noticed, man, they are just mowed to the, you know, it looks like the park area around the parking lot, and the road down there has just been mowed again recently. So it's like, wow.
I would, one thing that you should put in there is say this is something to the effect of, this is particularly important to not mow too much around lakes because it encourages geese. Geese like short grass. And so when geese then poop in the, you know, the area that's been, you know, mowed as a tight little lawn there, all that bacteria and all that, those nutrients run into the water. And then you have toxic cyanobacteria blooms. And we've had to close several of our lakes because they weren't safe, because they had toxic levels of cyanobacteria in them. And that's directly related to things like, you know, geese around the lake that could be prevented if you had taller native vegetation. And there's some great documentation.
Yeah. Lon, do you mind just adding a sentence to that? That'd be great. I'd really appreciate that. And if you guys feel like the letter with Lonnie's addition, or if anybody has any other additions they want to make, and then I had to try to lay out a little bit of policy underneath it that supports examining the mowing.
The thing about adding that I would be somewhat against it is, this is a very nice letter to start the issue about mowing, and it is you've made it so lovely and personal that it would be hard for them not to take an interest. And if we put in too much that's also then scientific, and if you should do this, I think it would lose its impact. I think as it stands, it's a great way to start the conversation and then follow it up with this other stuff about mowing to get them to look at the whole issue.
So the other stuff, meaning the geese around?
Yeah, meaning the geese, because there are other things about, yes, about the geese, but certainly about the geese, yeah.
Yeah, I sort of agree with that.
Well, then I would say that maybe just a very short sentence saying, this is particularly important around waterways to prevent pollution issues.
Okay, that sounds good. Lonnie,
yeah. I wonder if you could add that where, if we're trying to keep it in this personal way, you have a sentence about the lack of mowing down near the dam, you know, on that slope or something. So that's at least close to the water, because the main meadow you're talking about is way far up near the entrance. It's not even close to the water. So if we're going to bring up the issue of mowing near the water, that's the only place that it makes sense to me that we would address that.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you guys want to, Lonnie, feel free to add that, and but it would be great to go ahead and send the letter out, and I can circulate around sort of in the final form. And but could we go ahead and move to send it out and get the conversation started?
I move to send it out.
All right, wonderful.
This. Yeah.
Yeah,
I second.
Good
sign too. You got to include the sign.
You like the sign? Okay.
No mowing, yeah, that's a good one.
All right, and so Nancy second, Emily, you're all in favor of that, and Lonnie, yep, great.
Not that my daughter's officially speaking, but yeah, I support it.
Oh, that's right, that's right. You said, you reminded me like 5 times. Sorry. Thank
It's okay.
Thank you guys so much. And I know we kind of sped through that, but Grant, you have been patiently waiting. Thank you for sitting through all of this meeting. We're so happy that you are here to share with us a little bit of your work on wildlife corridors. I just recently watched a great documentary. What is it? A Thread, right? The Green Thread. And it was really inspiring. So we're gonna hand it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks. It's really interesting to be able to sit in on the meeting. I grew up in Albemarle County, so I'm familiar with most of the places you're talking about. Spent a lot of time up at Sugar Hollow. That giant sycamore tree on the way there is still one of the most incredible trees I've ever seen.
It has a name, actually.
Sorry,
It's
what
the
was that?
I said the tree. It's called the dancing tree. It's actually a named notable tree of Albemarle County.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't know that, but just, yeah, always was so incredible. I'm not surprised. Well, I can go ahead, and I have a few slides prepared, and then wanted to give a little background on some of the work that I've been involved in with mapping wildlife corridors and connectivity analysis. And then hopefully there's some time for discussion. I also was really interested in the biodiversity action plan, and looks like a really thorough job that was done on that document. And so if there's any conversation that I can be a part of around the connectivity planning, then I'm more than happy to be a part of that. So I'm Grant Canet. I'm part of a program at Smithsonian that's called the Working Land and Seascapes Initiative. And this is a pretty new initiative. It's just a couple of years old, but it's really focused on this idea that protected areas alone are not going to be the answer to the current biodiversity crisis. And so we really need to focus on broadening our portfolio and trying to do more in terms of conservation outside of protected areas. And so trying to then identify ways that we can have landscapes that work both for people and for nature. And I like to break the ice with this kind of embarrassing photo of me, but just to make the point that I started out first as a naturalist, being really interested in nature. Have been for a number of years an avid bird watcher, and in spite of studying salamanders for my PhD at the University of Missouri. I had a brief postdoctoral fellowship with the University of Missouri and the Northeast Climate Science Center that was focused on trying to improve survival estimates for this golden-cheeked warbler that you see in the bottom right. And so the challenge there is really that you ban these birds and a large portion of them never come back. And so the real challenge there is trying to separate the ones that we can actually attribute to being mortality events from ones that simply dispersed or moved territories as adults, which happens not as infrequently as we might have assumed. And then in 2015, I started a postdoctoral fellowship with the Smithsonian, where I actually moved overseas to the country of Myanmar. And working over there in Southeast Asia was really focused on providing data analysis support for a lot of the local conservation organizations over there. And then recently transitioned into a research ecologist position at Smithsonian. And so just to kick things off, these are probably some basic concepts that you're all familiar with, but when you hear the term habitat connectivity, we basically can think of that as just meaning well-connected habitats. So in theory, this is all really simple. But then when you get into the details, even the basic premise of what do we count as habitat for connectivity planning is really tricky. So how big does something have to be to represent a habitat for a species? Certain species use different habitats. There are even issues where you have what look like habitat patches that have a species of interest that's present there, but it is not actually a sustaining, self-sustaining population. It can be supported by immigration from outside areas. And then there's also the fact that sometimes we have areas that are suitable habitat for a species where often because of human land use, that species has disappeared from part of its historical range. And then we also need to be thinking into the future of how we ensure that we have connected landscapes that allow for the movement of species into new areas where maybe historically they weren't present, in order to track their climate preferences as global climates change. And so then the second part of this is just what counts as being connected. And again, this differs by species, that for some species, you can have two patches of habitat that are separated by human modified areas, and the species can actually move between those areas successfully. And so in spite of those two habitat patches not being physically connected, they still are connected from the perspective of that species. But there's a really famous study by Jared Diamond, the author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, who was an ecologist before becoming a popular author. And he had this famous study where he actually collected a lot of forest songbirds, drove them out into a lake on a boat, and released them. And they released these birds something like a couple hundred meters from the shoreline. And the real shocker was that we think of birds as really being the ultimate boundary crossers, that they shouldn't be impacted by human land use in the way that other species that have to actually travel across the land surface would be. But a lot of these species couldn't physically fly the distance back to shore. And so for some species that we expect should have the capacity to move between disconnected habitats, they're either unable or unwilling to do that. And then I think the final point here is that there's really a challenging question of deciding how much connectivity is really enough for conservation purposes. If you're really trying to avoid inbreeding depression as your primary objective, then something like 1 or 2 successful migrants per generation may be enough. But if you're really thinking about trying to maintain large, healthy populations by connecting multiple discrete habitat patches, then you're going to need much, much more. But how much more is that's really a challenging question, even for researchers really on the cutting edge of this field. And so from an email conversation with Leah, I thought I would point out these USDA corridor conservation guidelines, which is a nice resource, and I have some others at the end of the talk. But this shows some basic concepts about just the question of corridor width. So this is one small element of corridor connectivity planning. And the width that a corridor should be depends on what species that corridor is being designed for, based on their body size, how human modified the landscape is, how long the corridor is, that if the corridor is longer in length, it should also be wider in width in order to allow species to continue moving through that corridor. And then this time element is also important, that if you're really trying to maintain healthy long-term genetic connectivity between populations, then you likely need wider corridors. And so I wanted to highlight this study because this is a project I was involved in as a graduate student, where we were trying to develop some new data analysis methods for figuring out how this terrestrial salamander that you see at the right here actually moves across landscapes. And so this is a study that was done out in Missouri. And the lead author on this project, Bill Peterman, went out to this study landscape and collected salamanders from 135 different different collection locations across this landscape. And then based on the genetic similarity of, of individuals between these collection sites, you can actually use some analytical tools to, to figure out which underlying landscape features are driving gene flow and thus movement of the species. And so, sorry, I like to start with this example because it's a really interesting case study in how sometimes as scientists we can be dead wrong in our assumptions about what species need to maintain connectivity. This is a salamander that we assumed would have populations that were best connected along moist, wet ravine corridors. And just because of its biophysical requirements, this is a species that breathes entirely across its skin surface. It's in the family of lungless salamanders. And so we had this assumption that these moisture gradients would really be an important predictor of where salamander populations are connected on this landscape. And what we found in the end, based on all of this genetic data collection and this analysis we did, was that we were completely wrong and in the opposite direction in terms of how this species actually moved. That it turns out that when they're dispersing across more hostile, drier ridgeline habitats, that this species actually seems to increase its dispersal distance. And salamanders across ridgelines tended to be more genetically related than ones that were a similar distance along a ravine. And so I think I point that out because a lot of the studies on wildlife corridors are based on expert opinion about how these species should move in response to landscapes. And it's really the gold standard is really to have some amount of data collection that's used to either validate or design these corridor plans in the first place. And so for some of my work in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, I used a similar approach. And this is a really interesting study system because you have these different mountain ranges. This is the Unicoi Mountains here, and you have one species of salamander called a gray-cheeked salamander. In the Smoky Mountains, you have this red-cheeked salamander. You have this tiny mountain called this little range around Chiowa Bald in southwestern North Carolina has another salamander, the Chiowa Bald salamander. And then you hop over another mountain range and you get this red-legged salamander that looks really similar but is genetically fairly distinct. And so these salamanders are in some cases separated from each other by mere tens of kilometers. And because of the terrain in this part of the country, you actually get this speciation that has occurred at these really fine scales. And so to complicate matters when we think about climate change adaptation is that these individual species, these mountaintop endemics, are also hemmed in by a more widespread lowland species, the Southern Appalachian salamander that you see here. And so, and on the periphery of these species ranges, you actually get hybridization between these high elevation endemics and this more widespread low elevation species. So a really important question then is just how these species respond to the landscape. Is climate warming really a concern? Is that something that drives patterns of genetic differentiation and patterns of abundance on the landscape? And so I did a similar study where I went out to this landscape that has one of these 4 high elevation endemic species, the red-legged salamander. And in red, you can see collection points where I collected tissue samples from a number of salamanders and then could compare genetic similarity between these points and look at the effects of landscape features like slope, solar exposure topographic position. And ultimately what we found is that in this high elevation endemic species, that solar exposure and basically terrain, the dryness or how xeric the terrain is an important predictor of how these species move. And these ridgeline habitats are really inhospitable to this particular species. And so that's a little bit of background on some of my work prior to coming to Smithsonian. But then with Smithsonian, as I mentioned, I transitioned to this position being based in Southeast Asia, and very quickly got away from these more academic studies that were focused on new techniques and these genetic methods, and got into some pretty serious real world decision-making situations where the first of these was a case study that I helped with that was initiated by the World Wildlife Fund in Myanmar, where there was a proposed road development that cuts through this landscape you can see here. That's one of the largest continuous forest landscapes in all of Asia, or at least all of Southeast Asia. This landscape has tigers, elephants, Malay tapirs, lots of really interesting endemic and endangered wildlife. And basically we heard about this road project as bulldozers were on site starting to develop this planned 4-lane highway across this forest corridor. And so at this point, we were trying to, as rapidly as possible, come up with some recommendations for mitigation along this planned road alignment. And so WWF led a camera trap study where they went out and deployed these motion triggered camera traps all along the road. We documented lots of different threatened and endangered species that occupied the habitat along the road. And then based on that, we did some modeling to look at, based on expert opinion about how these individual species move in response to the landscape, we identified these multi-species crossing locations, I believe 12 in total along this road alignment. And then we're able to pass those recommendations along to the road developer and to the Myanmar government. And so this was a fairly tricky process because just within the mammal community in this forested landscape, you have a lot of variation. You have some species that really prefer low elevation forest. They do just fine in fairly degraded secondary forest areas. And you have other species like clouded leopard that are really strictly an intact forest specialist that prefers high elevation areas. And so with this assessment, we were trying to look at identifying corridors that worked for a number of different species, but where we ensured that each of our species of concern at least had a certain minimum number of suitable crossing locations planned along this road. And so there have been some really exciting developments since this study. The road developer basically agreed to implement recommendations. They even came back to us and they were requesting additional crossing locations if they were interested in placing more crossing structures like underpasses and modified culverts. And so the design report for this road is actually expected next month. And then WWF has continued working with a local indigenous group in the area to establish an indigenous conservation area along the road that I think is probably the only hope of protecting the buffer areas along this road from deforestation that often occurs when a new road gets developed in this region. So a lot on that study, but the process there was really a time-sensitive situation where we needed to come out with these recommendations fast because the construction was literally underway. And this was really a challenge. It required a lot of really busy people basically putting everything else on hold for several months to crank through this analysis and develop these recommendations. And it also involved a lot of different software programs, different web repositories for various spatial data sources. And so this brought us to this realization that just the way we operate as scientists is not really, or scientists and academics is not really compatible with these types of real world decision-making situations in a lot of cases. And so with WWF, we worked together on this, what we called the Mapathon idea. And so this was trying to take basically what we'd say is a no data, no problem approach to wildlife corridor mapping. And so we tried to develop workflows for doing wildlife corridor mapping using Google Earth Engine, which is an open source analysis software. And we worked with people in Myanmar on a number of case studies where basically they would spend several days digitizing roads, creating land cover maps, and then running these wildlife corridor assessments for real projects of interest to the Ministry of Construction, the Forest Department, and to these conservation organizations. And so along with developing these new workflows, we provided some basic training on mapping wildlife corridors. So the underlying theory, we created a lot of really useful baseline data on existing land use, linear infrastructure, and wildlife corridors in Myanmar. And then we're continuing to explore possible locations for future wildlife corridor work based on the case studies from this workshop. And so to give an overview of the process, the way this analysis is working in Google Earth Engine is that you start with a satellite image that looks like this. You then use some of the mapping features in this analysis, or some of the features in this Google Earth Engine platform to map the landscape. So we have here just a simple map of forest, non-forest, and roads. You can then assign travel costs. So this would represent the cost for wildlife to traverse an individual pixel in this image or in this map of the landscape. And then we can throw some source patches down, which are the white boxes in this image. So this is just a simple example or illustration. But then we simulate movement from those source patches, and we can calculate the cost for an individual of a certain species traveling from one of these source patches to any other source patch. And based on the cost of travel across different parts of the landscape, we can identify places that are better connected or more poorly connected. And so when we do this kind of exercise, we're looking here at these green areas would be the places that have a low travel cost for our species from the source areas. And then the places where these low travel cost regions intersect with roads would be places that we would expect more individuals of our species of interest to be encountering these roads, and those might be ideal candidates for crossing structures or mitigation. And so this is an example that I've used a lot in various presentations and in our Mapathon in Myanmar, and this is actually the satellite image this little illustration is based on is Whitehall, Virginia, and I think the Sugar Hollow area is just up this way. So I mentioned the travel cost values. And so just to go into a little more detail there, when we talk about cost, we don't mean money, but we're talking about various factors like how willing a species is to move across different parts of the landscape, how fast they move, what's their mortality risk trying to move through different parts of the landscape, so crossing roads or open agriculture areas. And then what's the difficulty of travel? Are there significant barriers to movement like steep slopes, roads, other barriers of that nature. But in summary, we can wrap all those things together and we can just say how likely is an animal to move through an area. And that's really, that travel cost is really the basis of most wildlife corridor analysis methods that are out there. And so when we did this corridor mapping with Google Earth Engine, the first time we were using really a code-based approach where these people who were part of the Mapathon workshop had to learn a little bit of basic coding to be able to modify this corridor mapping script. And here this is showing a web application that's currently in development, but where the idea is that a fairly inexperienced computer user could actually go in, they could create some reference data that teaches the computer how to recognize different habitat types. They can use a drawing toolbar to identify roads, railways, other features like that. And then they identify source patches on the landscape, and then we can simulate movement between those source patches and identify places that we'd expect to have higher or lower densities of moving wildlife. And so currently we have this fairly close to finalized. It's up and running, but we're working on some other things like optional bypasses. So if someone has their own data on roads or land cover, we want them to be able to input those directly rather than needing to create them from scratch in this environment. But that's something, this is a project that's been really exciting to just see how we've gone from a process that took months to a process that maybe took days and a little bit of computer expertise down to something that really can be accomplished in maybe 30 minutes to an hour if you have a fairly small focal area that you're interested in doing this type of mapping exercise for. And then going back to that question of identifying what counts as habitat for a species, this is another process that we've been able to move into Google Earth Engine. And I know here I'm probably starting to sound like a Google salesman or something, but we also are working on this type of process where we can create habitat suitability maps for species, where we take the basic presence data, we figure out a set of spatial data layers that likely predict where that species occurs on the landscape. We can run different models that make different predictions, and then we can average those predictions together based on some kind of model validation criteria. So ideally, we want a very well-validated model that tells us these are really the most critical habitats for this species. And something that's really exciting about the new frontiers in ecology, spatial ecology, is that with the growth in popularity of eBird and iNaturalist, these other citizen science efforts, now we're just starting to get more and more data on species locations from all over the planet, and it's just getting easier and easier to do these types of exercises to identify where important habitats are for different species. And so the final project I want to talk about is a proposed road alignment study that we're currently working on with WWF. And this is a new area of research for us, because in the past what we've done is we've basically said these would be the crossing locations along this road, but we haven't been able to advise at the stage where we can actually avoid impacts of roads on an environmentally sensitive area, where we've always been too late in that project planning pipeline and coming in on the mitigation side. But here we have a national park in Myanmar called Alongdo Katapa. And this is a park that has really incredible biodiversity. It's an important site for Asian elephants in Myanmar. Still has large carnivores like leopard and dhole, which is like the Southeast Asian equivalent of a coyote. And this site has been suggested as a potential future World Heritage Site, ASEAN World Heritage Site. But there's a proposed highway that would be a highway that runs all the way from India across the country of Myanmar, connecting to Thailand, that has a current alignment that cuts through a corner of this existing national park. And this national park has really steep slopes, rough terrain, which in Myanmar with the monsoon season means there's a high risk of landslides, and that has a high cost for infrastructure maintenance. it's just not an ideal place to have a highway in the first place. And then in addition to that, when we're planning highways through national parks, we're often recommending that you have reduced travel speed requirements. And that's based on a lot of literature that shows that really the #1 way of reducing, the most effective way of reducing human or wildlife vehicle collisions is by having lower design speeds of roads. So if your road is straight and easy to drive, even if you have that wildlife crossing sign, people are still going to drive too fast and they're going to hit wildlife. But if you design the road kind of at the planning stage to have a slower speed, then you can actually avoid most of those wildlife collisions. And so there's some precedent for doing this type of thing. There's a really famous study at this Cross River Highway in Nigeria, where some researchers proposed alignments that avoid some of the more environmentally sensitive parts of this landscape. And then in principle, this exercise is fairly easy, that you have a starting location, you have an ending location of your road, and then you want to try to avoid high cost areas. And the costs that we want to avoid, they can be basic engineering costs, like based on the amount of pavement that's required, the amount of earth moving that's required, the land acquisition costs, but also things like road gradient and road curvature are things that are design considerations for the end users, for the people driving the road. And then there are also the environmental impacts. So in this simple diagram, the blue and green areas could just represent different types of costs. And the goal is that we try to find a win-win situation where a highway alignment can avoid most of the high cost parts of the landscape. And so this is a really preliminary assessment where this is something fairly new to me, but I've been trying to use an approach similar to what was used in one of the recent gerrymandering cases that was in front of the Supreme Court, where they basically showed if you take these district boundaries and you tweak them just the tiniest bit, you end up with less optimal distribution, a less optimal distribution of votes for the party in power in that state. And so that's pretty strong evidence that these district boundaries were drawn specifically to allocate the vote in a way to ensure the largest number of seats for that party that controls the legislature. And so we're doing something similar here, where we're basically starting out with a completely random proposal of how this road could get from point A in the top left corner of the map to point B in the bottom right. And then this area in the middle, this high plateau, is the Olonga-Katapa National Park. And so here we're starting with this random proposal, and then we're just tweaking this alignment one point at a time, a couple points at a time, over and over again, something like 1 million times. But then we are also evaluating these costs, and we tend to favor the solutions that have lower costs, and then we adopt those solutions as our new baseline, and then we go and modify those proposed solutions again. We do this over and over, and that's basically what you see here in the map, is that we start with these crazy random alignments, and towards the end, you get something that's fairly straight, avoids most of the roughest terrain. And this has been a pretty encouraging preliminary assessment, because right now we're just considering these 3 costs: the earth moving costs, the acquisition and development costs related to land cover, and then the cost of paving the road due to its length. And what we find is that this final road alignment is basically the current proposed alignment for this highway, with just a few slight modifications. So when the road developer has identified this alignment based only on the development cost, we're finding that with this optimization strategy, we can actually recover that initial alignment. And so the next steps for this process will then be to add in some additional costs, like some of the gradient and curvature constraints, but most importantly, looking at the most suitable habitats for wildlife in this landscape, and then factoring those into this cost optimization as an additional component, trying to identify that solution that can hopefully avoid most of the negative impacts on important wildlife habitats. And so that's really all I had. Some of the next steps with this are thinking about really the future forecasting. So if we can study recent patterns of land use change, like what's happened in the past 20 or 30 years, can we then forecast that land use change forward? And then when we do that, can we also then measure what the downstream impacts might be on connectivity of important species? And then continuing to work on this alignment planning that I just showed the illustration there. And tomorrow, WWF actually has a really important meeting with Myanmar's Ministry of Construction, where they're planning to present some of these initial results and try to get the go-ahead to launch a little more substantial effort to identify an alternative alignment outside the national park. And then we're also, through this collaborative team of Smithsonian and WWF folks, we're also trying to launch new projects to support private wildlife conservancies in the country of Kenya, trying to figure out how, when you have these individual parcels, these privately owned conservancies, what it would take to basically manage them as a whole or as a cohesive management unit. So how can we maintain connectivity? What are the most critical management strategies in terms of allowing livestock grazing, fire frequencies, things like that. I mentioned this ongoing work, doing some advising with Myanmar's Ministry of Construction. And then we also do a lot of these technical trainings on some of these mapping techniques. And we had trainings planned this year in the US, Kenya, and Myanmar. And right now with the COVID situation, all of those are being most likely moved to virtual and postponed somewhat to be able to develop the content. But it's just really an exciting program that I've been a part of. And then also just want to mention that as part of this Working Land and Seascapes initiative, we're always interested in hearing from people about potential projects or potential collaborations, interest in tools and technical training, so feel free to reach out. And then finally, just wanted to put up as a closer, some of these really great resources on corridor planning. There are these two websites, Corridor Design and Corridor Conservation. And Corridor Conservation is really, that's like my go-to corridor research. It's a place that they have a really large library of examples and other previous studies doing connectivity planning in different landscapes around the world. And then in 2020, the IUCN revised and released these new connectivity conservation guidelines. And that's probably the most detailed set of guidelines that I'm aware of on how to plan landscape conservation activities around connectivity and wildlife corridors. And then I mentioned this, the USDA guidelines. Those are a little more simple. They have some nice graphics and illustrations, but they're also really great as a primer on wildlife corridors and connectivity. So that's all I have, and happy to answer any questions or move to any discussion as you all see fit.
So I have two questions about data sets. The first one is there a way, we have some species in Albemarle County that are at the very edge of their range, and we're concerned about them due to climate change because of that, like Cornus canadensis. And it'd be interesting, we've had an interest in the past of identifying other habitats that may also be these little pockets of cold in Albemarle County where there may be refuges where species have survived. Is there a data set out there for of average temperature that one can apply to the landscape, you know, at like a county scale?
There are some. And there are people who do a lot of the climate modeling who are much more familiar with those data sets, but most of those data sets are not at a very fine scale. So if you're looking for potential things like an exposed outcrop or something of that nature, then that's more challenging. But I think most of the data is gridded at something like maybe a kilometer or a 4-kilometer grid. And so you could at least see across the county if there are particular temperature gradients. But I think some of that is based on modeling where it accounts for elevation and other, elevation and topographic shading and things like that. But I'm not really familiar with all the details. GridMet is one of the data sets to look at. And there's another is the CHIRPS data set, CHIRPS. But I can't say I work with them very often, so I'm not the best resource there.
And then the other question I have is, if you could write those down for me, because I'm trying to find a place to write that down. I can't find it. But or if someone could write that down or put it in the minutes. But the other one would be a lot of the corridor planning seems to be focused on forests, but here in the southeast, grasslands are equally important. And the problem is differentiating native grasslands from non-native grasslands. You know, most of our native grasslands are warm season grasslands, and most of the non-native are cool season grasslands. I've been unable to, you know, in all the land cover maps I see everywhere, they just take grass and they just put it in one big bucket and treat all the same. Even in the Chesapeake Bay models, they're treating native grasslands as lawn. And so it's this huge gap. And if you're dealing with species that depend upon grasslands, and that is how they connect through their habitats, that's a difficult thing to figure out. I mean, like, how do you conserve those?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. And that's something that we've dealt with a lot in Kenya, is trying to identify it's trying to separate pastoral lands so intensively grazed pastoral lands from agriculture, from more natural grasslands. And yeah, that's a really tough one. I was part of a group we did some initial planning for doing a global grassland mapping effort, because it's just something that people really haven't done well, to my knowledge. That was a couple of years ago. But yeah, it's tricky. I think now the data sources available are getting better and better, that they now have these hyperspectral cameras that are on satellites, and finer resolution data and just much higher frequency. So then sometimes you can use a time series of images, like a whole bunch of images across a year, and then you can start to identify different plant communities based on like the timing of green up or things like that. But that gets into fairly complex mapping as compared to something as simple as just forest, non-forest. I'm trying to.
Yeah, I know. The Southeastern Initiative has been trying to do some of that work, but working on it in Virginia that I know of. If you ever hear about someone trying to do that effort in Virginia, please let us know, because I think it's very important. I really wish we could have it, if nothing else, for the Chesapeake Bay to sort of separate out some of these different grassland types. It's still crazy to me that we treat them all the same. Because, I mean, with the Bay model, the lawn grass is contributing pollution, where your warm season grass is reducing pollution. So it makes a big difference to know one from the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if I hear anything, I can definitely get in touch. We have another program at Smithsonian that's focused on private lands conservation in Northern Virginia. It's called the Virginia Working Landscapes Project. And so they're doing a lot on grassland management practices and trying to work with landowners and things that I think are really well aligned with the biodiversity action plan, that they're thinking about questions like how do you time mowing to avoid negative impacts on grassland birds, and what kind of native grass coverage do you need to maximize your biodiversity at a property level. But I don't know all the details there, and I'm not aware of anything being done to actually map anything like native grass coverage.
So I've got a question for Grant with input from Kim. So I'm gonna look at my notes here. So in Albemarle County, there's GIS layers that address many different issues and sets of information in the county. So Grant, is there a way that we could use the Google Earth Engine to come up with something related to habitat suitability or habitat suitability map, and also other wildlife data layers that we could integrate with the GIS maps we have in the county that we're already using?
It's definitely possible. Google Earth Engine is free, and you can create an account. It takes some expertise, or at least there's a fairly steep learning curve to starting to do things with Earth Engine. It's all code based in either Python or JavaScript. So it's not the same as Google Earth, where it's point and click. But they have a really large data repository in Earth Engine, so you can access a lot of data. But then things that are like county level data sets, then you can upload those to your own Earth Engine account. And then once they're there, you can do other spatial analyses using those data sets. So we definitely do that a lot, that we'll upload something like the boundary of our study area, and then we'll draw in all of the freely available satellite data that's within the Earth Engine data repository. But it definitely can cross communicate with outside data. You just have to bring it into the Earth Engine environment.
Okay, Kim, you're nodding your head. You understand a little bit of how that would be done?
Well, I don't understand it, but I am nodding because I would love to continue this conversation. We do have to wrap up in about 5 minutes, just to let everybody know, because Carolyn has to get to this next meeting. But I hope we can continue this conversation, because as you know, Leah and I told you that about our biodiversity action plan, and we have this fabulous connectivity analysis that was done by the Green Infrastructure Center through a grant. And I would love to talk about, for our next conversation, move this to how we can build on, what we have to use some of these tools potentially that you've described to us tonight, to help us refine that and focus our efforts on, where good project sites might be.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. And it's looking through that connectivity assessment. It's basically using the same methods, that it's weighting the travel costs by the total travel distance between the source patches. So it's a fairly compatible analysis. So if you have this more county level analysis that exists, and then you want to zoom in and do some more site focused assessments, then you could basically do it using the same methods with this web tool. And that web corridor mapping tool, I can definitely share the link when it's ready, which we're hoping is a few days away.
Wow.
And that you will not need any coding experience or anything like that. You can just go in and point and click.
Well, thank you so much. It's so exciting to think about having access to these tools and, you know, living in the 21st century, right? You can do these things with such speed. And I hope that we can continue the conversation with you. It's been really great, and hearing the work that you've done. And I'm sorry that we have to cut it short, but we do, because we have to let Carolyn get prepared for her next meeting. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us, and I hope that we can continue this. I also just want to recognize Rick Barnett, who has one of our attendees, and again, thank Rod and Maggie Walker for joining us. And thanks to all of you guys for your work, and looking forward to continuing this. And
Your work is it's very inspiring too. I'm really excited to see how what you're doing with the World Wildlife Fund and everything. It's just great.
Thanks. Well,
Yeah.
likewise, it's
Yeah.
great to hear about all this activity happening in Albemarle County.
we're trying our best.
Yeah. Well, really appreciate you all including me in your meeting and letting me share a little about some of this research. And feel free to reach out if I can ever, continue the discussion.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant.
Welcome.
And thank you to Carolyn for being here and supporting our meeting. You guys all have a great rest of your evening.
Bye, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.